Okay, the last video I talked about the War of 1812, and now I want to talk about events that led up to the destruction of Prospect Bluff or Negro Fort. I've done videos about it before, so I'm not going to cover this a whole lot and want to try and make this under 30 minutes. I did an early version of this video and went over that, so I need to go through the material real fast. There's plenty videos and books and articles and materials out there on this subject. I just want to cover a couple things that a lot of people don't know or forget about it. First off, after the War of 1812 ended, um, after the Battle of New Orleans, I should say, is that the British left behind with their native allies stands of arms. There was a British Colonel Edward Nichols, who established two forts on the Apalachicola River. Most people only think about the first fort, about 15 or 20 miles up the river, Prospect Bluff, also called Negro Fort. The virtual picture behind me is a picture from the fort, or actually you can see the fort on the left and the Apalachicola River behind me looking over it. It's called Prospect Bluff. It's only about 10 feet above sea level, but it is the highest point on land from the mouth of the river down at the Gulf of Mexico. This is the fort that most people think about. They don't realize that Colonel Nichols also established another fort on the north side of the Apalachicola River, or right south of Lake Seminole, or was it Woodward Dam, um, where the Chattahoochee and Flint River meet each other and form the Apalachicola River. There's a Indian Mound complex, which the British built Fort, they call it Fort Nichols or Apalachicola Fort. Originally, there's a Spanish fort or mission there also, but it's mainly on the mound because it's a high spot. The river floods in the spring and this time of year. In fact, the forestry website of the Apalachicola Forest says that don't visit it right now. Right now it's end of January because the river is flooding. In fact, when I went there and made a video, it was in April about 4 years ago, and it was flooding, had flooded at that time. And I came like the week after the water had gone down and the ground was still wet. So anyway, I'll try to put the description of that at the end of the video. So even though it's called a bluff, it's not very high. And Nichols established these two forts and armed them. This fort here became a colony of free blacks, really the first original colony of free black people in Florida. And well, more about that later. And also there's the northern fort that Nichols made a treaty with the Creeks and Seminoles, and really recognizing Seminoles as separate from the Creeks for the first time on paper. And there's some interpretive signs that have been established at the site. It's in Chattahoochee, Florida, at Chattahoochee Landing. So anyway, getting into the history, after the Battle of New Orleans, people were afraid of the British returning. They didn't think the peace treaty would last. The war was over, but they didn't feel like the British wouldn't try and come back again and try to take New Orleans. So there was a lot of panic in the city. And this time there would be no stopping the British if they did do that. Congress was going to authorize $100,000 to transport volunteer troops from Kentucky or Tennessee. The problem is that if they had done that, well, it couldn't be done to begin with, because after the war, the government was pretty much bankrupt. They didn't have the money, and the 5,000 troops they're asking for from Kentucky and Tennessee, it's very unlikely that they were going to find 5,000 volunteers that would be willing to do that. So, it's really fortunate that the British did not come back, because We don't think that New Orleans would be able to hold them back this time. Andrew Jackson had returned to the Hermitage, and he was barely alive at this point. He had had cholera, I think. He had still carried a bullet from a duel. Actually, he'd been a number of duels, including a knife and gunfight with Thomas Hart Benton I think it was in Natchez or Nashville? Anyway, is during the War of 1812 there, and Jackson was the only one wounded, and he barely survived all that. Uh, just some interesting history. Uh, they're looking for a general officer to replace him to be the main general officer guarding New Orleans. The most likely candidate, General Edmund Gaines, he was not available because he was recuperating from wounds in the war as well. So there was really no leader to take over and do what Jackson did at the Battle of New Orleans and gather this army of different backgrounds, multicultural, racial army. And so that was not going to happen. And the climate, the atmosphere, there'd been the perfect storm, I guess you'd say. There's a series of volcanic eruptions in the previous few years that was topped off by the explosion of Mount Tambora in Indonesia. That was the largest volcanic eruption in 10,000 years on the Earth, and it affected the weather for years to come later on. It happened in 1815, and in the winter or summer of 1816, that year is called the year without a summer. It remained cold. There's even snow in North America and Europe during July and August. There's so many clouds in tephra, made really brilliant red, dark sunsets. The worst part was the clouds of sulfur dioxide that were shot up in the atmosphere, and it came down in villages in China and Europe and killed the people from the gas that came from those clouds. So it was a very dangerous, deadly time, and it affected the weather on the Earth for years to come. It'll affect Florida in the 1820s and cause everyone to have no crops for that time. Because of the cold winter, there was global starvation all around the world, in Europe and North America especially there. And that had a big impact as well, because when people are starving and going under severe economic pressure, then they start to revolt and rebel, and you have political upheaval all around the world. We know pretty much from other sources, you can find out about Prospect Bluff and Negro Fort. What happened at this time is that the Spanish were really overseeing this part of Florida, and the Apalachicola River was the gateway up the Chattahoochee and Flint River to the main plantation and cotton growing areas of Georgia, of the United States. So these two forts stood as a gateway to that economic activity. So the United States and the cotton plantation owners could not ship their cotton down the river without encountering these forts. And my argument has always been is that one reason why the United States wanted to destroy the forts was the economic reasons that was blocking their cotton getting to market in New Orleans and Mobile. So that's something I think everyone needs to think about as well, besides the is a sanctuary for the fugitive slaves that are escaping from the plantation. Andrew Jackson, he wanted to destroy Negro Fort or Prospect Bluff from the very beginning, and he was given the go-ahead from the Secretary of War, John Calhoun, who told him basically do what you see as necessary. The Spanish could not do anything much about it anyway, and they were pretty powerless. They had been conquered by Napoleon, and once Napoleon was disposed, the Spanish government was very weak and ineffective after that as well. So Andrew Jackson was putting out his feelers to see what the situation is with the Spanish government in Florida. Remember, in the War of 1812, in November 1814, Andrew Jackson took over Pensacola because the British were being sheltered there. Now, he sent an envoy named Ferdinand Amelung, who was from Louisiana. He was in the French militia, and his militia unit became part of the 44th Infantry, and he was a captain in the infantry regiment. After the War of 1812, the armed forces were reduced, and the 44th Infantry was combined into the 1st Infantry Regiment. And Captain Amelung, he was born in Germany, and his family moved to Louisiana. He spoke German, French, Spanish, English, so he was multilingual. So he was sent as the envoy to talk to the Spanish governor, and I'll put a link in the description below. The Library of Congress, see if I can do this without, anyway, the Library of Congress has his letter in their collection, and I'll put in the description. And they also have a transcription, which I found the letter first and transcribed it myself. Then I found the transcription. But this is really interesting, and it tells what's going on at this point between the Americans and the Spanish. And Captain Amelung, he's writing to Robert Butler, who was Andrew Jackson's adjutant, and also somebody who's actually an adopted son or raised by Andrew Jackson. Robert Butler became the first Surveyor General of Florida, and all these surveys in Florida are off the prime meridian that Butler established. Kind of interesting history of Florida history there. Anyway, Captain Amelung writes to Butler, or really Jackson, in obedience to your order received on the 6th of May, I proceeded the next day for Pensacola, but owing to the adverse winds, having to wait 12 days at Bay St. Louis, I only arrived at the place on the 24th of May. I was received and treated with great attention by the governor and his officers, and after receiving his answer to your letter, I left there on the 27th and arrived here on the 2nd instant. So he leaves New Orleans, goes and talks to the governor in Pensacola, and then comes back. I have the honor to transmit herewith the answer of the governor, which I think embraces the points touched upon in your letter, and also take the liberty to subjoin a translation thereof, as it might happen that no person is near you understanding the Spanish language. I am firmly of the opinion that the governor asserts the truth of his communication, and am convinced that the inhabitants of Pensacola have suffered and do now suffer more than our citizens of the existence of the fort and its garrison. I also take liberty of the communication, such intelligence as I have been able to collect from good authority, which might perhaps be of some use. The Spanish are also worried about the fort on Prospect Bluff because their slaves are running away as well, but they can't really do anything about it. So that's pretty much what that says. But the Andrew Jackson and the Americans, they're confused. They're getting both of the forts kind of mixed up. They're thinking it's Apalachicola Fort up near the forks of the river, and they find out in this letter that it's Prospect Bluff. Continues, it says, the fort in question is situated on Bonavista on the eastern bank of the Apalachicola River, 15 miles above its mouth, 120 miles east of Pensacola. The river discharges itself into St. George Sound, and the vessels drawing not more than 10 feet of water may come in between St. George and St. Vincent's Island. The bar, however, is dangerous and requires a skillful pilot. The fort was constructed by Colonel Edward Nichols, and Woodbine, and the British occasionally resorted thither, but on their final evacuation of the country, left it in possession of a garrison composed of Negroes and Indians with 4 pieces of ordnance and 10,000 pounds of powder. Actually, it was much more than that. It was 10 pieces of ordnance there, but we'll talk about that in a minute. About 20 Choctaws, a number of Seminoles, and a great number of runaway Negroes are supposed to have been there some time ago, but a great part of these brigands have abandoned the fort on account of the scarcity of provisions and have gone to Savannah, alias St. Joseph River in East Florida, whither they will no doubt all retire in case of attack by land, as they have a schooner and several large boats to make good their retreat. If not intercepted by sea, from this spot they can easily annoy our settlements on the Flint and Hold Georgia frontier, and are in a country where they can procure subsistence with facility. One thing that they're saying, they said the St. John's or St. Joseph or Savannah, what they mean is the Swanee River. Many of the people here had already escaped Prospect Bluff and gone to Old Town on the Swanee River. In some of the old documents, the Swanee River is called the Savannah. So it creates a little confusion if you don't know the background of what you're talking about. And the Americans are afraid from there that they will become river pirates and sail up from the Swanee or get in the boats and go up from Negro Fort and attack Georgia plantations on the Flint River and the Chattahoochee River, which is actually something that happened around that time is on the Mississippi River. And here's the really good part, where Captain Amelung says, Pensacola itself is, I can assure you, entirely defensive. Garrison consists of 80 to 100 effective men, exclusively of a battalion of colored troops, say about 150 men, of whom the inhabitants themselves stand in constant dread. They have about 150 serviceable muskets and about 500 musket cartridges, and not enough gunpowder to fire a salute. So Captain Amelung saying that all the muskets that they have that can operate, once they fire about 4 shots, they're out of gunpowder, and they don't even have enough gunpowder to fire off a salute when the flag is raised in the morning. The citizens are definitely afraid of their own garrison, colored men in the garrison who are actually relatives of the warriors, the black warriors that have escaped to Prospect Bluff. And I'll continue here. He says there's only one cannon at Fort Barrancas. Says one gun was mounted at Barrancas on the day I left there. To this is to be added the dissatisfaction of the inhabitants and even a number of officers of government and desire of the majority to see a change effected. I must not forget to present to you, on par of the governor, the thanks of the inhabitants of Pensacola for the exemplary and humane conduct of the army under your command while at Pensacola, and I verily believe their professions to be sincere. He says that the governor and the people are thanking Jackson for his invasion there 2 years early in 1814. The governor also, on mentioning in conversation that I was persuaded you would willingly assist in destroying the fort, said that if the object was sufficiently important to you to require the presence of General Jackson, he would be proud to be commanded by you, and that the Captain General of Cuba, if the Captain General of Cuba could not furnish him with necessary means, he might perhaps apply to you for assistance. So the Spanish governor is saying to Jackson that if Cuba can't do anything, then please, you can go and destroy the fort, and I'll even join you and be under your command, which is kind of something unprecedented to say. A foreign governor that he'll be under the command of a general. So that's kind of an interesting background of what is going on at the time. So we know about 6 weeks after this letter was written, the Americans went and destroyed the fort and did just that. The Army under Colonel Duncan Clinch came down from Fort Scott at the confluence of the Chattahoochee, Flint, and Apalachicola River, and they headed south, but they could not do anything because when they approached the fort, of course, the people in the fort fired upon them and kept them away. Duncan Clinch, when he was coming down from Fort Scott, he ran into Major William McIntosh, the Creek chief, who had 150 warriors, who was also coming to attack the fort. And Duncan Clinch here says in the Army Navy Chronicle about McIntosh, it says the Creeks, their objection was to capture the Negroes in fort. William McIntosh was in the illegal slave trading business, smuggling slaves through Spanish Florida and selling them. He was in cahoots with the Indian agent David Mitchell. So McIntosh is illegally selling slaves. And that's actually something that Andrew Jackson put an end to when he came down 2 years later. And Duncan Clinch is saying the black chief heaps much abuse on the Americans and said they was left in command of the fort by the British government, and they would sink any American vessel that should attempt to pass it and blow up the fort if he could not defend it. So the garrison in the fort was going to fight to the death. So the Americans brought up their naval gunboats. They had 2 naval gunboats, also towing 2 barges of supplies coming up the river to be deposited at Fort Scott. Gunboat number 154 with Sailing Master Bassett fired upon the fort. First, when the ships were coming up in the morning of July 27th, 1816, the fort fired about 9 rounds at the boats, doing no damage. The gunboat fired 4 shots, and just to get the range of the cannon, the 5th shot, it heated up a cannonball red hot, fired it off, and it went into the open door of the powder magazine and blew it sky high. The explosion was so bad that there was not a more bigger, devastating explosion until the Civil War. So it was horrific beyond belief. It says from Clinch's letter, the war yells of the Indians, the cries and lamentation of the wounded, compelled our soldiers to pause in the midst of victory, to drop a tear for the suffering of his fellow beings, and to acknowledge that the great ruler of the universe must have used us as an instrument in chastising the bloodthirsty and murderous wenches that defending the fort. So, that's what General or Colonel Clinch wrote. But it's interesting because also in his letter here in the Army Navy Chronicle, General Clinch, or Colonel Clinch, I guess at this point, he says their cornfields extended near 50 miles up the river. There was 350 people in the fort, and they don't have cornfields going for 50 miles for just 300 people. So it was probably at one time a very substantial size settlement there. And Clinch was afraid that there was a large body of Seminoles coming down from Miccosukee town to attack in retaliation. But of course, they never arrived. Clinch and the Creeks under McIntosh got the heck out of there. There was a doctor with Colonel Clinch's, and pretty much this was all the explosion was the work of the naval guns. There, the Army Infantry, 4th Infantry under Colonel Clinch was pretty much totally ineffective, except they picked up the artillery pieces, and they gave all the, I guess, the muskets and arms that there's still about 2,500 to 3,000 rifles, muskets, and pistols that were left behind. That they mostly gave to the Creek Indians. And the cannons they put on the Navy vessels to take back to New Orleans. And also the Navy vessels collected the flags, the British ensign flag and the bloody red flag that they said was flying over the fort. And those flags are now in the naval collection in Annapolis. So that would be kind of cool if somebody could ever find those in the collection and display it, because I'd like to see those. That would be neat, that part, amazing part of history. So the doctor from Clinch's expedition, his name is Marcus Buck. He's writing his father, talking about this terrible scene that he's seeing there. It says talking about almost exterminated by the explosion of Negro Fort. He says, you cannot describe, or you cannot conceive, nor I describe the horrors of the scene. In an instant, hundreds of lifeless bodies were stretched upon the plain, buried in the sand and rubbish, or suspended from the tops of the surrounding pine trees. Here lay an innocent babe, there a helpless mother, on one side a sturdy warrior, on the other a bleeding squaw, piles of bodies, large heaps of sand, broken guns, accoutrements, covered the site of the fort. The brave soldier was disarmed of his resentment and checked his victorious career to drop a tear on the distressing scene. As soon as the flames were extinguished, their attention was directed to the restoration of the life of those who were least injured. So there was some survivors. There's about 300 people in the fort, and about 90% of them were killed. About 10% or 30 of them survived. And so that was just a horrible scene. What's interesting is that from the archaeology work, that was only one magazine that was destroyed in the fort. There were two others that survived, and that's, of course, where they found the other arms, the muskets and rifles, and what was there. And the doctor finishes writing to his father. Of course, this is the most Florida thing, real estate scam. He says, first-rate land can be purchased in Florida for 50 cents an acre. What speculations, if it should ever be ours, which I think will be the case. So he's saying land speculators are already selling the land surrounding the area, and it's still Spanish territory. It's not even American land at this point, but that's kind of what was going on at that point. Kind of, what else can we say about that? The remaining prisoners that the Americans took, only a few of them were actually determined to be from American plantations. Most of them were found out to either be free, or there was a few that were determined to be Spanish slaves. And most of the survivors ran to Miccosukee and Old Town. It was quite a permanent settlement. Now, a little bit more history. The first letter I read by Captain Amelung, he got into some financial trouble and actually went to jail for 9 months and killed a man in a duel back in Louisiana. So he resigned from the Army and became a sheriff of Baton Rouge, which proves in Louisiana you can have a criminal record and go to prison and still run for political office there. So Captain Amelung, he was sheriff, and he got in another duel, and he was the loser this time. He was shot and killed, shot in the head, and that was on August 7th, 1821. So he died at age 35. Now, Heitman's list of Army officers says it was 1820, but I actually found that was in 1821, according to newspaper articles I found. So, you just lived a very interesting life, but died a pretty violent death back then. And so those were a couple interesting letters I wanted to bring to your attention. I didn't want to cover the whole history of Prospect Bluff or Negro Fort because there is plenty that can be said about it and other videos that cover it much better than I do. And so I just wanted to give you that. My future videos, I'm going to go over more letters from the archives of information that people are not aware of, not so much a linear timeline, but more from the letters itself written by the people that were there, which you'll really enjoy. One more thing about the background here at Fort Prospect Bluff or Negro Fort. It is now part of the Apalachicola National Forest. It's out in the middle of nowhere. Even today, it's very remote. My navigation, and this is true, when I went out there, the navigation on my cell phone said that I was in Siberia. I got no signal at all out there. This photograph behind me was taken in 2016, the 200th anniversary of the destruction of the fort. We had a memorial event out there in October 2016. In October 2018, Hurricane Michael hit this area very bad, knocked down a lot of trees. And I think the oak tree that I'm getting shade from in the photo might still be there, but the park has been closed since then, so you cannot yet visit the park. I looked on the website yesterday for the Apalachicola National Forest, and it said the site is still closed. So it was damaged extensively. The good news is that the archaeological work that's been able to be done since then has revealed a lot of what we now know about the site. So that's interesting. And in fact, Bill Steele, that I know, who did the archaeological work in Battle of Okeechobee, he did an archaeological report on the fort for the forestry. It was only supposed to be 15 pages. It ended up being 60. So that's how thorough he is. But it was all good information. And so next time, let's see if we can, I can tell you some more about the First Seminole War.